Today we're going to be looking at an unbelievably brilliant game played by former world champion and arguably the greatest player of all time, Garry Kasparov. Emphasis on the word arguably because I know there's going to be a lot of naysayers, but there is a case to be made, and it's actually been made by none other than Magnus Carlsen himself.
Garry Kasparov, in my opinion, the greatest player there's ever been. Genius. Garry was certainly a hard...
Okay, that's enough. We want to get into this game, which was played when Garry Kasparov was only 13 years old. It's been called an immortal game, and for good reason. The attacking sequence that Garry comes up with just seems to materialize out of nowhere, as if he's manifested it through sheer willpower alone. Though it's actually an incredible synthesis of deep positional intuition as well as razor-sharp calculation based on a perfect grasp of his opponent's subtle weaknesses, which are present in this position, specifically the vulnerability of all these different pieces. This game has been compared to Bobby Fischer's game of the century, which he also played at age 13. Magnus Carlsen has played a game that has been called immortal at age 13. So I don't know what's so magical about this age of 13 when it comes to future world champions, but if you've seen these games, let me know in the comments which one you think is most brilliant. If you haven't seen them, I'll put links in the description so you can check them out, but let's delve into this game. Garry Kasparov has the black pieces. His opponent, an 18-year-old Armenian by the name of Sambat Laputian, opens the game with d4. Knight to f6 now from Garry, who has actually played this opponent quite a few times before, and a few years before this, they had been pretty evenly matched, but that is quickly changing as Garry's playing strength is now skyrocketing, and he's about to leave him in the dust. We have c4, g6, and we're headed right into very well explored King's Indian territory, where white is of course allowed to get the big pawn center, which black will look to undermine later. d6 from Garry, discouraging e5, and now f3 from Sambat, the same-ish variation, which is not quite as fashionable as it once was, though still very playable. White is giving maximum support to that big pawn center. That's his pride and joy, but this comes with some strings. You can't play knight to f3. You have a potentially sensitive diagonal now if you castle kingside, not to mention this move makes zero progress towards castling. But Garry's not castling either. He's going for some rapid queenside play, wants to strike at that pawn trio as soon as possible. We have some natural developing moves with a6 from Garry, which he follows up with rook to b8, getting ready to strike on the queen side if Sambat dares castle over there. Maybe even willing to sack a pawn in order to open up this file for his rook. So Sambat says, fine, I'll beat you to it and play rook to b1. My queenside expansion is coming quicker and I'll just castle on the king side. But again, he's made no progress towards castling. He's actually gotten further from being able to castle since this rook has been moved. So Garry says, fine, I'll focus on that instead. I'll get my own king to safety. Yours is still in the center. Let's see what we can do with that. Even at 13, he's already a master at adapting to the situation on the board as it evolves, move by move. Now Sambat just barrels forward with b4, not worried at all about his centralized king. The engine liked b3 a little better, going for the ultra-solid pawn structure. White doesn't have very good piece coordination on the king side though. If you play knight g to e2, you're blocking your bishop. If you play bishop to d3 first, and then knight g to e2, then your bishop's going to be vulnerable to knight to b4, unless you play a3. So I can see how playing b4 made some sense to Sambat. And here on move 9 is where Garry Kasparov begins to set the stage for the brilliant sequence of moves that will immortalize this game, which I'm sure he has not yet calculated out to the end. Right now he's playing intuitively. Garry knows that he can't just sit back and let white play bishop to d3, knight to e2, and castle without challenging him in some way. His biggest trump in this position is that his king is safely castled, his opponent's is not, and so the time to strike is now, and Garry does so with e5, hitting that proud pawn center, and fully anticipating Sambat's response, d5, at which point you're not playing knight to e7 when white has just taken more space, he's got the pawn wedge, your g7 bishop is bad. No, Garry knows that he is committed to knight to d4, which is not a pawn sacrifice yet, but it's still a commitment and will end up being a pawn sacrifice in a moment. If white were to try to grab immediately on d4 with bishop takes d4, e takes d4, and then queen takes d4, then he runs into a big disaster with knight takes e4. The queen's hit, and if you play queen takes e4, then there's rook to e8, pinning and winning, or bishop takes c3 check, equally crushing. So in the game, we instead have knight g to e2, hitting the knight with another piece, which now does threaten to win a pawn. And if Gary were to play knight takes e2, then after bishop takes e2, you have the same problem. Bad bishop, pawn wedge, white has more space, gonna castle on the next move. So at least with that knight entrenched on d4, you've got something. Now it's at this point that the 13-year-old Garry Kasparov really begins to take control of the game. Perhaps he's recalling his chess teacher, the great Botvinnik, who basically told him to control the variations, don't let the variations control you. So Gary begins steering this game exactly in the direction he wants it to go with the top engine move, c5. Backing up that knight, threatening to replace it with a pawn, protected by a pawn if it is captured, thereby establishing a passed pawn on d4. So unless white wants to give up all hope of maintaining an advantage, he's got to eliminate that c-pawn. While he can, with d takes c6 en passant. And at this point, Gary can still back out of the pawn sacrifice with knight takes c6, which looks bad because of this backward d-pawn. But the engine actually thinks it's fine for black, who can get counterplay by targeting white's c-pawn. But not surprisingly, Gary didn't like this position. He would rather sack a pawn to get some piece activity. And so he plays b takes c6 instead, opening the eyes of his rook, which of course allows knight takes d4, e takes d4, and bishop takes d4, grabbing that pawn. So what does Gary have in return? Well, after rook to e8, he has two activated rooks. He's got his bishop on g7, no longer blocked by a pawn. The white king is still in the center, now opposite a rook, so Sambat blocks that file with bishop to e2, preparing to castle, unpinning the e-pawn. Which is important because if Gary were to play d5, then you want to be able to capture that e-pawn with e takes d5, so that after c takes d5, you got c5 with a huge advantage for white. You got the protected passed pawn on c5, black's got the isolated d-pawn, he can't stop you from castling next move. So Gary wisely avoided this line, and instead found the only good move he has at this point, which is an incredible move, because in order to know that it works, you really have to calculate the entire crazy variation that ends up getting played in this game, which is about 6 more moves for each player, so about 12 total moves, and they are not obvious moves at all. So how far did Gary actually calculate at this point? I don't know. He must have seen his move which comes right after the one he is about to play, which is the move that gets all the credit for being the brilliancy. But this move here is the one that really sets the stage, and in my mind, it's the true brilliancy. Pause the video and try to spot it if you want, but here it comes in 3, 2, 1. c5, hitting the bishop, hitting the pawn. And what are you gonna do? Give up the bishop pair? Give up the pawn on b4? No, you're gonna play b takes c5, exposing an attack on the rook. And you're gonna expect that black will play rook takes b1 check. And after you capture with the knight, and black takes on c5, you're gonna grab another pawn with bishop takes c5. And now you're 2 pawns up. Black does have the better development, so maybe if he's lucky, he'll get one of those pawns back. But in the meantime, you'll complete your development, and you will just be winning. But of course, this is not the variation Gary had in mind when he played the move c5. After Sambat took the pawn on c5, Gary does not play rook takes b1. He leaves his rook hanging and instead unleashes a powerful double exclam counterattacking move. Try to spot it if you want, but here it comes in 3, 2, 1. Knight takes e4, just tearing into the center, counterattacking the queen so that there's no time to win the rook. And zeroing in on a far from obvious defect in the white position, and that is that the knight on c3 is a bit overloaded, being the sole defender of the rook on b1, which means you gotta capture this knight with a pawn. F takes e4, but now here comes queen to h4 check, and things are really starting to get nuts. Now black has quite a few different options here, all of which Gary must have looked at in order to see that his knight sacrifice was working. Let me go through white's options quickly here. starting with the king moves. If you play king to f1, then there's rook takes b1, knight takes b1, queen takes e4, hitting the bishop, hitting the knight, and so best is bishop takes g7, allowing queen takes b1 check. You block with the bishop, the king takes on g7, and you take on d6. At which point the piece count has equalized. White has an extra pawn, but look at the sad state of his pieces. Pinned bishop, king who can't castle. The engine says black is nearly a pawn better. Okay, what about king to d1? This leads to a similar line. Rook takes b1, knight takes b1, queen takes e4, bishop takes g7. Only difference is that after queen takes b1 check, you're blocking with the queen, and then there's queen takes c1, king takes c1, the king captures on g7. You defend your bishop on e2 with king to d2, d takes c5, and here black is a healthy pawn up with a better bishop and therefore is winning. Moving on, we have bishop to f2, which would be winning for white if black didn't now have bishop takes c3, a counterattack on the white queen. Best here is bishop takes h4, rook takes b1 check, king goes to f2, now we take the queen, white takes the rook on b1, and d takes c5, after which the material has equalized and Stockfish is giving double zeros. So this is what Simbat should have played. But we can be grateful that he didn't, because then this game would be far less epic and would not be called immortal. What was played in the game, and played very confidently according to Gary, was this move g3. After which Simbat thinks that he's winning. He thinks that he's tricked Gary, who responds by addressing the threat to his still undefended rook on b8 by playing rook takes b1 with check, but Simbat does not recapture with knight takes b1, because then queen takes e4 is a triple attack, hitting these three pieces, and white is losing. He instead plays king to f2, probably wondering how Gary let himself get into such a predicament. His queen is under attack, the rook on b1 is under attack, and what he probably expected Gary to do, if he didn't just resign, was to move his queen, after which he would just lose his rook on b1. And according to Gary at this point, Simbat began to stand up, probably to stretch his legs and take a breather, thinking he had the game in the bag, but before he could go anywhere, Gary busted out an incredible move that Simbat had no idea was coming. And that immortal move was... Pause the video if you'd like to try to spot it, but here it comes in 3, 2, 1. Rook to b2. Absolutely fantastic. And Gary said that as soon as he played this move, Simbat's demeanor completely changed. He did not see this coming at all, and he knew he was in big trouble. The point to this beautiful deflecting move is that if you play queen takes b2, then the bishop on d4 falls with check, and once the king moves, e1 is the only square where you're not getting mated in 9 moves or less. Now we have bishop takes c3, coming with an attack on the queen, a fact which is enough to guarantee the win, but as sort of a bonus we also have a check, which means that queen takes c3 is the only reasonable move, after which we have queen takes e4, threatening the rook on h1, threatening checkmate on e2, and there is no good way to defend against both. White is lost. Incredible. But this was not seen in the game. Simbat played a better move, which nevertheless still loses. He just captured the queen on h4, which led to the following variation. Rook takes queen on d2, of course, bishop takes g7, king takes g7, and now king to e3 from Simbat. It's a good try, but you'll notice that after the smoke is cleared, Gary is the exchange up, but Simbat is threatening to capture the pawn on d6 and get the dreaded connected pass pawn duo if Gary's rook leaves this d-file, which unfortunately it's now forced to do, being hit by the king. So Gary plays rook to c2, attacking the knight, which should clue you into his intentions for this position. After king to d3, hitting the rook again, does Gary run to b2, allowing his d6 pawn to fall, giving white ample compensation for being down the exchange and throwing away the win? Of course not. He gives back the exchange by taking out the correct minor piece, and which one do you think that is? White's crappy bishop on e2, who is restricted by his own pawns? Or the knight on c3, who is eyeing that beautiful post on d5? Well, you guessed it, we have rook takes c3 with check, the king takes, and now d takes c5. So let's stop and assess. Black has a better bishop, has a better pawn structure, which isn't very hard because white's pawn structure is almost as bad as it can get. None of his pawns can defend each other. So here it's just a matter of mopping up. We have bishop to d3, Gary hones in on the d pawn with bishop to b7, which can't really be saved. This is pretty elementary now. He plays rook to e5, so the pawn can't be pushed. And after a4, follows up with f5. The pawn is pinned to the rook and will be lost. So Simbat tries for some desperate counterplay on the open b file with rook to b1. The pawn falls, rook to b6. He's gonna win that a pawn, but now f4 and Gary's passed pawn is too fast and too dangerous. We have rook takes a6, f3. The bishop tries to blockade with bishop to f1, but now bishop to f5 clears the way for some rook e1 action. Now we get a check with rook to a7. King goes to h6, king to d2 now, trying to stop rook to e1. f2 threatens it again. Bishop to e2 blocks the move, but here we go. Bishop to g4. You got to watch over the f1 square. So the bishop goes to d3, but now rook e1 is on the board. Rook to f7 provides some necessary additional coverage to the f1 square, but here comes bishop to f5, blocking the access. a5 from Sabat, dreaming of his own queen, which of course he'll never have. Bishop takes on d3. You can't take the bishop. Of course, you got to take the pawn with rook takes f2, after which two of Gary's pieces are under attack. Did he just get tricked? Nope, because he's got rook to f1, attacking the rook, defended by the bishop. He will hang on to his extra piece, and so Simbat resigns. A valiant effort, but what are you going to do when you're up against an attacking genius of Gary's magnitude? Despite his youth, Gary was able to almost miraculously tie together seemingly unrelated weaknesses in the white position into one grand sequence of moves, which began all the way back on move 15 when Gary played c5, which unbelievably only works because of the vulnerability of the rook on b1, the undefended rook on h1, the centralized king, the vulnerability of the bishop on d4. All of these factors come into play because b takes c5 is just winning for white without knight takes e4, exploiting the vulnerability of the rook on b1. And knight takes e4 would not have worked without queen to h4 check, exploiting the vulnerability of the king. And queen to h4 would not have worked without rook to b2 on move 19, exploiting the vulnerability of the bishop. And then you have this line that could have been played with queen takes b2, the bishop falling on d4, and then you get this queen takes e4, where black gets the double attack, and we see the vulnerability of the rook on h1 come into play. And there's probably other alternative variations too that I didn't have a chance to get to that are just as significant as this. I didn't go as deeply into this game as I wanted to because there was a lot to unpack. But thanks for joining me on this epic journey through one of the most fantastic chess games ever played. This was a first for me. I'd never seen this Immortal game before, but I am still in awe. It is a thing of beauty. So thanks for watching. Subscribe now if you want to see more videos like this on the regular, and I will see you soon.